Good morning, folks. Thanks for joining us today. I'm going to go ahead and just keep rolling. If someone could just send a note in the chat box that you can hear me, I'll appreciate that. And hoping that you can. I'm Tracy Gonyu, Community Resource Developer on the Community Food Systems team here at Oregon Food Bank. Our team is focused on developing and supporting a network of food system advocates across the state of Oregon through the F.E.A.S.T Leadership Network. We like to host these quarterly webinars on topics that you suggest to build and strengthen the network. Today, we're excited to spend time diving into our flagship community organizing model, F.E.A.S.T, which stands for Food, Education, Agriculture Solutions Together. Before we get started, we ask that you keep yourself muted to minimize background noise. And if you have any questions today, type them into the chat box. I'll be scouting out for your questions there. And we have a bit of time at the end for Q&A. So I'm going to go ahead and advance the slide here and show you our agenda for today. It's very full, and we've done our best on the front end to address the questions that you posed during the registration process. So hopefully we'll get to those. And it is an absolute pleasure to introduce my colleagues this morning. You'll be hearing from Sharon Thornberry, who has been a grassroots organizer, trainer, and advocate for community food systems, rural communities, and anti-hunger work in Oregon since 1986. She grew up on farms in Iowa and North Carolina and was very active in 4-H and Girl Scouts. She was one of the first female members of Future Farmers of America, and her work experience includes food service, retail grocery, and union activities. In 1979, she was a homeless mom with 2 small children. Sharon served on the Oregon Hunger Task Force for 16 years. She served on the board of the Community Food Security Coalition for 6 years and served 3 years as president. She served on the board of Bread for the World and Bread for the World Institute for 6 years and will rejoin in March 2016. The sum of her experiences have come together to make her a passionate and knowledgeable community food security and anti-hunger advocate. She is the 2009 recipient of the Billy Odegaard Public Health Genius Award from the Community Health Partnership of Oregon. She has worked for Oregon Food Bank for the past 17 years, focusing on rural food systems, and is the creator of F.E.A.S.T, the nationally recognized community food systems organizing program. She has been a resident of Philomath, Oregon for 30 years. She is an avid gardener and loves to share the cooking traditions learned in the farm kitchens of her youth with friends and family. You'll also be hearing from Spencer Masterson. He is dedicated to building more equitable and resilient community food systems. In this effort, he has completed a county-wide community food assessment and follow-up addendum, organized a community food group, developed a community orchard on public housing property, and is the author of reports on the topics of community food systems, rural grocery stores in Oregon, a guide to coordinating grassroots community food assessments, a good agriculture practices audit program in Chile, and a co-author of a human rights report in Thailand. As Community Food Systems Manager at Oregon Food Bank, he leads a team of community organizers working statewide to conduct community food assessments, host F.E.A.S.T community organizing events, and provide technical assistance and support to CFS organizations throughout the state. He's a member of the leadership team for the Oregon Statewide Community Food Systems Network and is the vice chair of the Oregon Farmers Market Association Board. Spencer is going to start us off this morning with a background on our Community Food Systems team.
Great. Thank you, Tracy. So at Oregon Food Bank, our Community Food Systems team, we envision communities across Oregon and Southwest Washington where citizens are empowered and actively engaged across sectors to attain personal and community food security. And really we have 3 approaches to this work, and the first being Community F.E.A.S.T, which I won't go into too much detail because we're going to spend the whole time talking about. The second is a partnership with an AmeriCorps program here in Oregon called RARE, which stands for Resource Assistance for Rural Environments. And we've been working with RARE to place AmeriCorps members throughout the state of Oregon to complete county-wide or sometimes region-wide community food assessments. And we've been doing this since 2008. And we've completed 19 assessments covering 27 counties and hope to complete with partners who have done food assessments in other parts of the state, hope to complete Oregon and have a community food assessment for every county by 2017. And as part of these community food assessments, not only is it a goal to create a report that the community can use to identify opportunities for going forward, but also it's really we see it as an organizing process, and something you're going to hear a lot about F.E.A.S.T today is that really our work in the community food systems team, or our work on the community food systems team, is to help communities identify solutions to hunger, and also that they are community-driven solutions. So more on that in a second. The last approach is that we work on building the community food systems network. And so Tracy mentioned we host these F.E.A.S.T Leadership Network webinars on a quarterly basis as a way of providing support and technical assistance to our organizations, not only in Oregon, but also with partners around the nation. But also in the state of Oregon, we run a listserv called Food for Oregon, which is a forum for sharing of events, grant opportunities, and other resources around food systems work. We host regional gatherings of community food systems organizations throughout the state. And then, as Tracy mentioned, I'm on the Oregon Community Food Systems Network, and we've been an active participant in development of this network of community food systems organizations throughout Oregon. And then at the national level, really Sharon has been the lead on this, but we've been working on creating the food systems network within food banks nationally, and last September hosted a national conference for Closing the Hunger Gap Network here in Portland. Sharon is also hosts F.E.A.S.T facilitator trainings throughout the nation, and we are active participants in conferences as well. So that's a bit about our team. And the next slide, Tracy, is kind of shows sort of the way that we see our role in this work is really on the more of the left-hand side is where we, the Oregon Food Bank, are most active and hands-on is in the planning and organizing steps of creating community-based food systems. And so that's really working on relationship building, F.E.A.S.T planning, and we'll go into a lot more information about F.E.A.S.T today. Doing organizing work with communities through our community food assessment model, which if you want more information about that model, we have a guide on our website called Conversations Across the Food Systems, which goes into more detail about the organizing component of our food assessments. But then we also see F.E.A.S.T events as community organizing, our community organizing model. And working on, and something that we'll emphasize today about F.E.A.S.T is really that it's action-oriented. It's not just organizing to create relationships and to build networks, but actually to put that network and put those relationships into action. And then moving along into the developing and sustaining sections of this diagram, we really see our role is to help communities develop and sustain their own projects. And so we provide assistance, and we'll go into some more detail about our follow-up to F.E.A.S.T that include strategic planning and also project development that come out of F.E.A.S.T. And then as far as the long-term goal of this work is to really see that the programs and projects are community-owned and therefore are sustainable. So it's not an organization like Oregon Food Bank that works throughout the state that's leading a project in 60 different communities in the state, but instead that we really help communities in long-term visioning and project sustainability and looking at economic development as sort of a long-term approach to hunger. So that's a little bit about sort of our role in this effort. And with that, I'll turn it over to Sharon to talk about the F.E.A.S.T model in more detail.
Good morning or afternoon, wherever you are. We're going to just talk in detail about what happens at a F.E.A.S.T and how we came to be doing this. And the first thing we want to do is play a video for you of a F.E.A.S.T in Florence, Oregon. And we'll hope this works.
You might want to talk while it's not coming up.
So while she's queuing that up, I'll talk about the F.E.A.S.T model. F.E.A.S.T was developed as a response to help communities move to action around community food systems work. The events are organized by a local leadership team and feature local organizations. It convenes a conversation that leads to a self-determined action plan for food systems work. It really is about what the community wants, not about an agenda that we carry into the room. Right now, mostly Oregon Food Bank staff serve as facilitators here in Oregon. We provide suggestions, feedback, and support, but we definitely do not direct the outcomes. The reason that I developed this model originally was I had been doing community food assessment trainings out of the USDA model, and was unable to. We were doing assessments, and we do nice little thunk books by that assessment model, and nothing was happening. And so I realized that we needed to do two things. We needed to change our community organizing approach and make it more action oriented and make it more about what people were saying. And we needed to change our assessment process to a more grassroots model. And Tracy's working on queuing up the video right now. Are we going to get it?
I think so. It might be small. Hopefully get it a bit bigger.
Should be able to.
So what?
Sorry, folks. We've got a few messages that sound's not coming through, so we are going to try to troubleshoot that. Apologies for this technical difficulty.
I'm going to go ahead and just talk a little bit more about what happens at F.E.A.S.T. So community members tell their story of the local food system. And we'll talk more about how we figure out who that's going to be in a few minutes. Participants are introduced to the community food systems organizing and language of community food systems. They identify priorities through a group visioning process. And action plans are created to address the priorities. We used to call them organizing plans, and we realized we really needed to communicate through our work that these were action plans, that we actually expected things to happen, and that the leadership team really wanted to communicate that to participants. So we've changed our language, and we actually got that from some other rural organizing folks. We also have resources and tools in the packets that people get that inform their plans. We think things like the farm census, map the meal gap, other data that we think is pertinent to a particular area. Got it?
We can try it again. And
We're going to try one more time. Folks, let us know if you're hearing the sounds in the video.
This web, as you can see, the video is on our website. If you go to OregonFoodBank.org and go to the tab that says Our Work and then down to F.E.A.S.T, you'll get a chance to look at the video. Sorry about that.
I'll send out a link to this as well in a follow-up. Go ahead, Sharon.
Okay, so why don't we get the slides going again?
I'll get you back up. Maybe.
All right, so we're working on getting the slides back up here. So what everybody says to me, what makes F.E.A.S.T different about this? Why is it different? In part, it's because of community self-determination. We don't go with an agenda. We work on. We're there to hear what the community wants and to let them make their own plan. The way that the agenda is structured for creativity. So when we ask for people to do visioning through a snow card process, they get to put their ideas down. It's adaptable and flexible. For example, number one, we're able to, because of it, we're able to, in the way that we do it, we're able to change our path if we see that things are not working with a particular group or if we need to change. We also adapted according to the community. We're now doing this in tribal communities, and when we do that, we're using the food sovereignty tools from the Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance, and we're able to have discussions with them about what that means for their tribal areas. We define and use common language, and we think that that's been beneficial to us because it's caused a common language across the state, which has been more effective with funders. And so when an organization or a group applies for food system funding, or if they're talking to policymakers, people are consistently hearing the same language. And that would have happened probably without us, but probably not as quickly. And in very rural communities, they might not have picked up on that. So we think that's been very helpful to build that knowledge base and to build a common language. The other thing is that it highlights the local knowledge base, both through the panel that we have, but also through discussion and through people participating in the action planning. One of the things I find, especially in rural communities where people are kind of, they do what they do, and especially out here in the West, and they're doing it on their own, and they aren't necessarily reaching out to a lot of people, so people don't know what they know. And this gives us an opportunity to get that out and on the table for what people know about their food system, and they start to share, and there's interesting new linkages made. The other thing is that people walk out of a feast with tangible next steps. So they have their action plan, and we've had groups that met within the first week afterwards, but we also make sure that they have plans to meet at least within 3 months, and we'll talk more about F.E.A.S.T follow-up. So they're walking out of the room knowing that they're going to come back together.
Do you want to go back? We missed some slides about walking through.
Talked about them.
Okay.
We could. So, okay. The leadership team. This is extremely important. For one thing, we don't go into community and say you should have a feast. We pretty much wait for people to call us. Sometimes we're recognizing that there's a community that's maybe on the verge, seems to have a lot going on, and they get benefit from that, and we'll make the suggestion. But for the most part, from the first year on, we've really not had to go to communities. They come to us. What's important about that is that they maintain local ownership of the process. And we can act as the coach. But that leadership team also needs to be there so that there's commitment beyond the event. We're looking for people like community gatekeepers and leaders to either be on the team or to at least endorse the event. One example of that is recently I did the F.E.A.S.T facilitator training and was working in Hawaii. And we needed to make sure that we had some Hawaiian elders who were bought into what we were doing, or people were not going to participate. So we worked hard to make sure that happened. You also need to do some special invitations to certain leaders. Some people don't even recognize themselves as leaders, and that's looking for those folks and getting them involved is important. The other thing is you need to make sure, it has to be worth our time to do this. and we want to see this information and utilized in the community, and we want to see the event succeed. So we want commitment beyond the event. Here on the slide is some of the folks that you might reach out to and where to find them. Yeah, okay. So yeah, I did that.
Didn't see it.
Okay. So what we want to do, because you didn't see the slides, is go back and walk through. I was talking while we were trying to get the piece queued up. So we're going to go back and look at the slides where I was talking about the agenda. As I said, we have a next one. So community members tell the story of their local food system. This just gives you some ideas. The picture that you're seeing with the gentleman standing up, the other thing that we encourage people to do is have displays. And the display in the background of that picture on the left is from a local community where the grocery store, there's one grocery store locally run, and they couldn't come, but they took pictures and talked with him, and somebody represented them on the panel. So that's another possibility, is that if you have, like a grocer who is very, very busy and maybe it's a family-run business, they will, you can have somebody interview them and represent them on this panel. Go on to the next one. As I said, we do the language. We go through local programs, and then priorities are identified through a group visioning process. On the picture on the left, you're seeing all those multicolored sticky notes. Those are large sticky notes that we use in what we call a snow card process. People get, depending on the size of the group, they get 1 to 2 snow cards that they can put up. I actually see people trading because they want they want extra, be able to put extra ideas up. The question that we ask people, though, when they're doing the snow card process is, what is important to you and what would you work on? We don't want people to put things that they're not going to put energy in up on the board or up on the wall. And this happened to be in a place that had glass walls, so that's what we used. Sometimes it gets interesting where we put the snow cards. Let's go on to the next one. I talked about the action plans, and you can see more of the snow carding. What happens in that visioning process is we get all of those things up on the wall, and then we sort them out into categories, and that's how the action groups are formed, is according to the categories. So you see the group in the lower left-hand corner, and they've got all of their stickies for their group on a piece of chart paper, and they're working to put together their action plan around those ideas. All right, now we need to move to the community engagement slide. So one of the things, I came up with the one in the middle on there.
Just put
it all up there. There we go. So slides coming up in a little bit odd order. One of the things you want to do is make sure you have a broad representation in the food system. During the planning process, we work with people to brainstorm who should be at the table, who's important, how do you get a broad representation. We encourage people to think about both grassroots and grass tops. It's an interesting discussion when you put wholesalers and school superintendents and farmers who'd like to sell to the school in the same room. People who want to sell to a grocery store and actually have the grocer represented in some way. Another thing is to meet people where they are. So this is a very simple process. It doesn't feel like an overly planned process. It's friendly to anyone. no matter what their reading level is. It works for everybody. We have professionals, and we have had kids participate very successfully in this, especially out here. We have a lot of homeschooled kids that'll end up being in the room. Or I've had ranching families take their kids out of school and bring them to this event because they thought it was important. It's a personal, we have the leadership team make personal invitations to the people that are going to be on the panel, stress to them why they want them there. We emphasize action and local ownership during this process. And we make sure to include the voice of those experiencing food insecurity. We try really hard to have people, low-income folks in the room, but at the very least we'll have people from shelters and soup kitchens and food pantries who take part in this. Now, so this is our organizing manual. It's up on the website. And you can, no, it's not on the website. You can request it from Spencer. Sorry, we've not put it on the website because we are updating it, and we don't want something out there. We want people to get the most up-to-date information. So now I'm going to turn this over to Spencer to talk about the different models of FEAST.
Yeah, so the example that Sharon was going through is sort of our flagship model of FEAST, but we've also recognized that in different situations, there's a need for a different type of event. So the event that Sharon was talking about is usually 4 to 6 hours, usually on Saturdays. It's quite a commitment. It is anywhere from a year plus in the planning to at least 3 months. It's quite an ordeal, and we really try to make sure that that a community is ready for that full FEAST event in order for it to be most successful. So next slide is one model that we've created that is a little bit smaller, and we've used it in planning of or in preparation for a large FEAST event. And also we found this to work really well in smaller communities. What is called our community conversation. It's usually around 2 to 3 hours. It's very like FEAST. The idea is to keep it fairly simple and not overly structured in terms of agenda to make it feel stifling, but essentially it has 3 components. We usually have these around a meal that is either at lunch or in the evening on a weekday, depending on the location. But the first component is we do a mapping activity. As people are coming in to attend the community conversation, we have a map up of the community and ask people to identify where there are food resources, farms, ranches, where the farmer's market is, where the grocery store is, where there are meal sites, pantries, and sort of an interactive mapping of their food system. And so that's sort of the first component. There is a meal. And then the largest part of the event is a guided discussion around 3 major questions. What are the challenges in terms of accessing food or growing food in your community? What are some of the assets that are already available to the community? And looking at those challenges and looking at the assets, what are the opportunities that we see going forward for improving the food system in their community? And really the idea is to focus on using existing resources and assets rather than thinking really more long-term about what are large changes that would involve maybe funding or the development of a new infrastructure project for a food system, but instead focusing really on tangible things that using the existing assets in a community, what can we work on to address those challenges? And like I said, this is ideal for smaller communities, and it's been helpful in sort of preparation for a feast. A lot of these events, at the end, people start to get excited about, like, wow, that wasn't enough time to really delve into these issues with in as much detail as we want. So then we can start to work with them to plan a more full feast event. So that's one other of the models under the FEAST suite of events. The other is what's called Hunger-Free Communities, and there's a national movement that is called the Hunger-Free Communities Network. But what we've done is we've taken the FEAST model, the flagship FEAST model, which is really trying to engage people from all across the food system, but instead used the same exact agenda that Sharon went through, but instead focusing on bringing together direct service and social service providers of an area to address gaps and improve collaboration. So this is like FEAST with a focus on anti-hunger organizations or social service organizations in a community. Like I said, it follows the exact same format as FEAST. And this model is ideal for communities expanding hunger relief, or where long-established organizations that might have been serving those experiencing hunger are in transition, or in desiring more collaboration around the community. We found this model to be really helpful in developing those relationships within the anti-hunger or hunger relief arena. So that's the Hunger-Free Communities model. And then this was a question that was several people brought up in the registration for this webinar, but what happens after FEAST? And this is something that every community is slightly different, but what we've been calling these events after FEAST is sort of FEAST follow-up. And the most simple version of this has been just reconvening the FEAST group. And this sometimes will happen a month after the event, sometimes will happen a year after the event, but it's an opportunity to bring all of the people that came to FEAST back together to discuss what has happened since FEAST, a reminder of what the work groups or the small groups discussions were, and the action plans that came out of those, and then also to discuss, okay, what are the next steps forward? Do we, as a group, the FEAST group, want to meet monthly to kind of keep these conversations going? And so that's kind of the most basic form of FEAST follow-up, and we provide support in terms of reconvening that meeting and getting folks together. Another, a little bit more formalized follow-up is that we work with FEAST groups to look at longer-term action planning and prioritizing those work groups. So out of FEAST, we usually have 4 or 5 work groups that have some action plans that are sort of vision-based. So they're not with a really concrete time, but more of like, what is our end vision and how do we work back from there? What we've done in a lot of communities is doing some prioritization activity. So looking at the visions that were in each of the work groups and creating some 1 to 3 year sort of time frames around how are we going to prioritize the work that we want to do, and which work group is sort of the bubbles to the top is the most that folks are most interested in working on. Another type of follow-up that we've done sort of along the same lines as prioritization is that in FEAST we've worked with a lot of organizations, food systems organizations, and what we've done is helped to do strategic planning for organizations that have either been planners of FEAST events or were participants, but can be sort of the local ownership for the FEAST process. And so we've been doing more formal strategic planning for organizations. And the last type of follow-up, which we've just piloted this year in one of the communities that we've worked in for about 4 years now, which is Cottage Grove, which is in western Oregon. For those in Oregon, probably know where it is. It's near Eugene. But location isn't important. But what we've been doing with them is an activity called ripple effects mapping, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. Washington State University has worked on it. Minnesota, All of it.
It comes out of the Northwest Area Foundation and Community Capital's work.
Yeah, and the idea that what we've noticed is that there's all of these little ripples of activity that happen after a feast event. And sometimes we're able to explain those when it's a really big ripple. And I know later on I'm going to go into some more tangible, concrete things that have happened as a result of feast. But oftentimes there's other ripples that we don't hear about, or that most of the community might not know about, but one person that attended a feast talks to another person that gets a project started. And so we really wanted to, for our own sake, to see what all of those ripples were and be able to have essentially a visual representation of all of the actions that have come out of feast. But also to help the community in that prioritization or in identification of what the next steps that the feast group wants to work on. So the ripple mapping, for those that aren't that familiar, if you Google ripple effects mapping, you'll see examples of this. But essentially you start with the program or intervention, so in our case feast, and then from there draw out lines that show activity that have come from that first program or intervention. And one way that you can analyze the results is you might see like, wow, the work group that's working on community gardens has got this huge long chain of ripple effects that have happened from feast, and we're have a lot of momentum and energy going into that work group. But say the advocating or advocacy work group doesn't have as many ripples. You can use this map to say, okay, well, the community garden activities are doing really great, and we can still support that, but it looks like maybe we can turn our attention towards our advocacy work. So using this tool as a way of helping a feast group to prioritize what they want to work on next. And so that's another one of our follow-up. And I just wanted to give sort of a case study of one of the groups. So I mentioned Cottage Grove. In terms of understanding sort of what their follow-up has looked like. We started planning with a couple of community members in Cottage Grove over a year in advance of having the feast event, and then worked with those community members and a local leadership team to plan the event, which we had in 2014. And then from there, the feast group decided to meet quarterly, and since April 2014, they've had quarterly gatherings where, just like I described that first bullet on this slide, the reconvening of the feast group, brought everyone back together and said, okay, this is, these are a reminder of the work groups that came out of feast, and each work group gave a little update about what they've been working on. And so the Cottage Grove feast group has been having these quarterly gatherings to kind of keep everyone appraised of what each of the work groups are working on, but also to have this sort of gathering of bringing together all of the people that were at Feast. And every quarterly gathering is an opportunity to invite new people to attend and to increase the movement in a community. And so that they've been having quarterly gatherings since 2014, and really, this has all been community driven. I mean, we've been around and have provided support in terms of what agenda items they should be working on, sort of organizational development for the feast group, topics, offering suggestion around program development, those kinds of things. But it has all been very community driven and community led. Those quarterly gatherings. And then just earlier this year, just last week, we did the ripple effects mapping activity with this group. And from that came some really clear next steps that that feast group is going to work on. So this is just to show an example of sort of the time frame of how long we've been supporting this one community in working through their feast follow-up.
So I just want to, now we're going to talk about lessons learned. Do you want to move? Okay. But before we start that, I just want to go back and just talk about this ripple effect mapping for a little bit. It's something that we're just starting to use. One of the biggest challenges with community food systems work at food banks is we can't report out on pounds and people in the same way that we do in food pantries or other food delivery systems. So we've had a very difficult time over the years with both our development department and in helping our board understand this. They know we're doing good things, but actually putting numbers and activities and telling the story anecdotally. This is going beyond the anecdotal stories and actually documenting stories and documenting effects. And we can, as we go forward, we'll be able to put numbers to it. So we're really looking forward to get a really good handle on this tool. And I actually think it's something that food banks could also use with their education programs, with their gardening programs, to tell the story long-term of those programs through individual conversations where you actually map the results of that education. So we'll keep you posted on that, and as we go forward, we'll put more things up on our website. So I wanted to talk about lessons learned. I'll just go ahead and put it all up there. We've been doing this since 2009 now. Quite frankly, I had no idea that it would expand to the point that it has. We've learned a lot about community readiness and what needs to be happening in a community before we get there. Like I said earlier, there needs to be a leadership group. It can't, when it's one person approaching you, you need to go back and say, you know, it needs to be 7 or 8 or 10 or 12 people we see sitting at the table. You also need to kind of look around in the community and do a survey of what's there, what's happening in terms of community food systems. Are there the seeds of that work there? Same thing if you're working on a Hunger-Free Communities event, what's happening? And are they ready to have a discussion that's going to change the way they do business? I've already talked about the active leadership team. It's key to the organizing. It's key to the follow-up. On the day of the event, it can appear to be very chaotic, and you need to remember that chaos is okay. Good things come out of chaos, and extreme creativity comes out of that chaos. So don't be frightened if you do one of these. I had the folks down at Food Bank of Northern Nevada do this, and they were going to have one in Susanville, and they had over 100 people registered, and they called me and said, what's going to happen? And I said, well, you're going to get a lot of good ideas. So chaos is okay. I'll talk about group size in a minute. You can adapt to community. For example, I use the Native American group. Or if there's a community where there's a group that's been doing a lot of work and you want to have them opportunity to report back on their work, you can build that into your agenda. You can also focus on a particular thing. We did a feast early on here in Portland that was about community kitchen facilities. And out of that grew an organization, but we adapted our discussion to that one goal. And that worked just fine. Manageable group size. I always say a manageable group size is like 35 to 50. We've done many, many feasts that were 60 to, I've had as many as 110. If you think you're going to have that group size, you have to have it in a facility that can handle that, and where your people are going to be able to spread out enough to hear each other when they're doing the action planning. And you're going to need some help when you're doing that. I recommend that you recruit 2 or 3 people who are going to help you keep an eye on the groups. One of the things with the action planning and being the facilitator is you have to walk around and make sure that no one person is dominating this. The other thing that we do, and this may add to the chaos, but it's fine, is we do not have recorders and facilitators appointed ahead of time. We let that leadership surface from the groups. And that often brings forth new people that the leadership team didn't know about. It gives them a chance to expand the number of people who want to take on issues in the community. And that's been very helpful. It also makes trained facilitators very nervous. And people who are type A and want everything figured out ahead of time. So it takes some coaching to make them comfortable with the fact that we're not going to have a group leader appointed, and we're not going to decide what the topics are going to be ahead of time, and we're not going to have recorders. It also makes the group responsible for the process, and that's a really big part of this, is that immediately within this process, the group is responsible for what happens that day. And I think that's also a key to our success and to the forward movement that we see after F.E.A.S.T, because people walk out of the room being responsible for what happens there and for what they do with that. Evaluation, we have an evaluation tool that we put in the packets. We also do some evaluation with the folks, the leadership team afterwards. Everybody needs to figure out, though, what evaluation is going to be meaningful to them. And is it about the numbers? Is it about who came? We've done things where we made a list of who we definitely wanted to have in the room and then come back and compare, did we get those folks there? That measures success. What subjects came up, and what subjects came up that surprised us. So those are the kinds of things that you talk about when you're in the evaluation. We can go to the next slide. Just go ahead. So the key things to remember here. Community foods organizing always highlights a community's resources and assets as well as its needs. This is extremely important. This comes out of the John McKnight work, that you always start with assets, not with needs assessment. My first work in social services was in community action, and every few years we would send out a needs assessment to the community, and we'd get back 1,000 responses and essentially make a list of what was wrong with the community, and then we'd promise to fix them, or at least fix some of them. And we weren't working with the community, and we weren't all looking at what the community's strengths were. So we start with that. We start with what are the resources they all already have, and what are the assets. And that's also important in extremely rural communities. Here in the West, we have frontier communities that have become very cut off from the rest of even the state. It could be 100 miles to a grocery store. So it's important in those communities that they talk about and see what it is they actually have. And that helps build confidence in the process. I'm sure everybody has been hearing about the Harney County work. And that's one of those communities where if you look at it from a deficit side, there's a lot of things, there can be a lot of deficits, but there's a tremendous amount of strength. And so we've worked very hard with those communities to focus on those strengths. And that also means that they can develop solutions that will go forward without outside help, that they can actually do within their community, and it will build their strength. The other thing is often you come up with some sort of an assessment tool, or an assessment comes out of this. You have to use that as an organizing tool. Anytime you do an inventory or an assessment, you use it as an organizing tool. And you always follow up with the people that you involve in that. It's one of the things, like I said, this came out of training people to do community food assessments, and we do them, and then they get presented to the county commissioners and the city council or whoever else it was, but it never looped back to the people who contributed. And a lot of times those kinds of community food assessments were more a collection of data than they were the opinion of the people or the thoughts and needs or desires of the people who lived in the community. You have to include the grassroots. You have to go to the people in most need. You have to go to the farmers. Often farmers are never asked or ranchers are never asked for their opinions, or fishermen. And so you have to include the grassroots. One of the things that's happening on the south coast of Oregon that Spencer's going to participate in is there's going to be something that we're calling dockside discussions, which I think will be a lot like community conversations, but they're going to be we've adapted the name so that it fits the fishing community, and it's going to be a conversation with fishermen who are often not heard from. You always do community foods organizing with communities, not to them. You can't organize for people, you have to organize with them. Another thing that's been helpful for us is just learning how to recognize where there's leadership potential. So we're looking for the kind of people who are looking for ways to improve things. They see challenges, not problems. Sometimes they see beyond the challenges and they already have solutions. And the challenge with that for you is to get them to back up and get input on their solution. They readily accept responsibility with a persistence to see something through to the end, and they encourage those around them. Some things for you to find out about this person: are they well respected among their peers? Are they a self-starter? Do they take initiative? Have they demonstrated leadership in the past? One of the things, talking about our very rural and frontier communities, there's a small group of people who do everything. And we often end up with the problem that that person is so busy they can't move this forward. So another thing is are they going to prioritize this work? You don't get to pick the leadership, they come to you, but it's really helpful if you understand them before you start this work, or take a good look as you're doing the work so that you can best support these folks. Now, we're going to move on to Spencer, who's going to talk about some of the impacts.
Yeah, so when we've said that F.E.A.S.T really engages the whole community, we've broken it down here to show sort of that we're working with nonprofit sector, the private sector, and the public sector. And there's some examples of types of groups. And in the organizing manual, if you're interested in getting a copy of that, we go into much more detail about who should be at F.E.A.S.T and have a list of folks. Sorry for those not in Oregon. OSU is our land-grant university, Oregon State University, but Extension should be, most people should recognize. But really, the idea is to bring all of these folks together. To date, we've organized 80 plus F.E.A.S.T events, engaging over 2,300 people. The model has been replicated in at least 7 states. I think now we're more into the 9 or 10 states. And it's shown to increase community connections among participants. Also, one thing that we're really proud of is that 30+% of the participants are food producers. Like Sharon mentioned, these are often folks that are hard to get into a meeting. But this model, either because of its adaptability or because of this stressing that food producers and the supply side needs to be in the room in the discussion around the food system, we've just made an emphasis to ensure that those folks are in the room. And then in 2013, we were awarded Feeding America's Innovation Award for F.E.A.S.T, which we're very proud of. So the next slide shows a list of all of the communities in Oregon and some of the communities around the country that the F.E.A.S.T model has been used in. And I saw there was a question around what is a community. Almost every one of these is the town except for in a metro area, you'll see up in the top left-hand side, there's North Portland. That was the community kitchens feast that Sharon mentioned. But really, we're doing these a lot in rural towns. So when we say community, it's a town. In some cases, we've done it at the county level. So for instance, in Lakeview, which is in south central Oregon, it's a huge area, and there's about 2,000 or 3,000 people in that whole county. And so that feast event was really seen as a countywide event. We've also done that in other places where the community is a county. But for the most part, it's a town. So that's where you'll see all the towns that we've had feast events in Oregon and some other parts of the country. So what has happened as a result of feasts? This is just some examples of things that have come from feast. In Newport, which is a coastal community, one of the big opportunities that group saw was a need for a year-round farmers market, not only for consumers to have access to local food year-round, but to also extend the market for local growers. And so from Feast, a group formed to create a year-round farmers market. In Lebanon, which is in the Willamette Valley, that group got back together after Feast about 9 months after, and recognized that the work around public education around the food system, like why you should care about local food, how do you do winter gardening, really they mobilized around education and outreach around food systems, and have since created a small community organization called the Santiam Food Alliance, and they host seed swaps. They do an annual food preservation fair, which there'll be different booths on all the different types of preservation, and encouraging folks to participate in what Oregon State University Extension has a Master Food Preserver class. So there'll be information about how to learn even more about preservation. They've also hosted a panel discussion on the food system. So really focused around the group one of the work groups at the Lebanon Feast was around public education, and that's really, really mobilized. Clatsop County is another coastal community. This was one of the first, if not the first, formal Feast group actually turned into an organization called the North Coast Food Web. They also mobilized around starting a farmers market. There was a farmers market in town that was more of a craft-focused and tourist market. This is on the coast, so you get a lot of tourists. So they wanted to create a market that was a grower market. Also have are offering cooking matters classes or cooking education classes, and now have a community kitchen where they're looking to expand even more opportunities around nutrition education. Cottage Grove, I mentioned that group. They really mobilized around community gardens, and took there was a greenhouse at the high school that had kind of gone defunct and wasn't being used. The mayor came to the Feast event. He had heard that people were interested in expanding community garden opportunities because the existing ones were full. Contacted the school superintendent, who said, yeah, sure, we're not using the greenhouse. And so since have rehabilitated the greenhouse and have added 21 garden plots on site at that school garden. So they've really focused around community gardens. In Grand Ronde, this is working with one of the tribes here in Oregon. They have a casino on site that was saying they had a lot of extra 5-gallon buckets that they weren't using. There was people that wanted to grow food but didn't have space. So in that picture on the right-hand side in the middle is one of the distributions of bucket gardens. And so they think they've given out, 300, a lot of bucket gardens, not to 300 different people, but so that was one thing that came from the Feast in Grand Ronde. In Tillamook, another coastal community, the Feast event led to the revival of the local Grange there. I guess I chose all the coastal communities. Coos Bay is another coastal community. They started a SNAP incentive or SNAP match program at their farmers market. We mentioned North Portland. The North Portland Feast event that was focused on community kitchens has turned into an organization called Kitchen Commons. Forest Grove, which is in just west of Portland, they use their F.E.A.S.T work plans and then a strategic planning session afterwards to provide input into the City Council's sustainability plan. And in the far northeast, Oregon and Wallowa County, the F.E.A.S.T group from there has, they were active in a community food assessment for the county and have since formed a food systems council for the county. So those are just some examples of things that have happened as a result of F.E.A.S.T. And Sharon, did you want to talk about another one in Clatsop County?
The other one that we have up on our website is that in Clatsop County, they started doing grocery cart gardens. They got their hands on some discarded grocery carts. They lined them with landscape fabric and then planted them as gardens, mobile gardens that people can use. One of the reasons that works on the coast is because of the wind. And sometimes you need to get your container gardens out of, or any garden out of the wind. And so it's been really successful. So Marion Polk has Food Share in Salem has also picked up on that. And I know there are a lot of places around the country that those mobile gardens. So there's instructions for the mobile gardens up on our website, and there's a brochure you can print out.
Great. And then another question that I saw in the registration was around policy work that has come out of F.E.A.S.T. So the example of Forest Grove using their work plan and strategic plan from F.E.A.S.T into the city's sustainability plan is one example of sort of policy efforts. But another one we wanted to mention was is the small home business or small home baking bill that was passed just last legislative session here in Oregon. And through Sharon's work going into communities throughout the state and also at F.E.A.S.T events, we heard that there were rural communities that lacked access to high quality baked goods. That town of Lakeview that I mentioned, which is in south central Oregon, there's one large bakery that services just one grocery store in the whole county, and so all the other towns in Lake County have to drive into Lakeview to pick up bread to bring back to their store to sell to folks. And so we were noticing that there was examples of this, especially on the coast as well, of towns and communities that just didn't have access to baked goods. And then we're also we're hearing that there are enterprising folks in these rural communities that want to be able to sell baked goods or other low-risk baked products to their neighbors, but permitting, the inspections, and startup costs were prohibitive. So we worked with our advocacy department here at Oregon Food Bank to draft a bill, SB 320, and they found legislative sponsors to create a bill that would allow small-scale home bakers, so those selling less than $20,000 a year, allow those folks to sell low-risk baked goods direct to consumers without having to be licensed or inspected. These are called cottage food laws. There's all over the country there are cottage food laws around a variety of different products. We just focused on bread with this one. There's already a bill in Oregon that allows farmers, that eases the restriction or eases the inspection and licensing around farmers that want to sell certain low-risk products direct to consumers. So we wanted to focus this bill on baked goods. F.E.A.S.T attendees and F.E.A.S.T communities really served as the basis for the advocacy organizing campaign. So getting folks to contact their legislators, come to Salem and provide testimony. And we're happy to report that the bill passed both chambers in Oregon with only one vote against. So this is just one example of a policy issue or idea that we heard through F.E.A.S.T communities and then mobilized F.E.A.S.T attendees and communities to get it passed. And another evaluation thing, not to be confused with the Ripple mapping, because this is sort of a mapping tool as well, but we've noticed that F.E.A.S.T is really great at creating connections and anecdotally, but we wanted to have some data to really see if that is truly happening. And so what we've done with some F.E.A.S.T communities is F.E.A.S.T network mapping, and we'll give a survey out to all of the attendees and ask, who do you know in this community, and how well did you know them? So that's that before picture on the left. And then 6 months later, we'll come back and ask the same people, all the attendees, to say, okay, now 6 months later, which of these people, and so we give a list of all the attendees, are you still working with, or have you strengthened relationships with? And that's what that middle map shows, are new connections or strengthened connections. The stronger the line, the stronger the connection. And so we've shown that F.E.A.S.T has, and we found in all the communities that we've done this, that F.E.A.S.T has created new connections and also strengthened connections. So that's just another evaluation tool that we've used. So that's about impact. Now, Sharon?
All right. So I just want to back up a second and talk about the bakery bill, because I want to give Tracy and Spencer credit for all the work that they did in organizing around that. The idea was mine, but they did the lion's share of the work. And part of that is because we've made all these connections in 80 communities across Oregon, 80 plus communities. I think it's closer to 90 now. We have a list of people who are interested in this across the state. So we were able to reach out to a broad spectrum of folks, both through the organizations and through those lists, to find out who was interested and who would be supportive. And then Tracy ran our social media campaign through our Facebook page, our Community Food Systems Facebook page. And we were really able to put together a lot of support, people who called their legislators. And we ended up with a very conservative legislator who gave a speech, very nice speech, that talked about freedom smelling like cinnamon rolls. It was fabulous. So that's probably our first legislative success, but we've been able to chime in on a lot of others, like the Farm Direct bill that happened 3 years ago that allows farmers to sell direct. So those associations have really helped us, and we're able to reach out on other issues that have to do with food banking too, if we think it's appropriate. I just want to talk about the materials and the resources that we have. So there's a planning guide for F.E.A.S.T that we use with F.E.A.S.T communities. It's like a workbook where people work through every one of these steps: where, when, how, who's going to be on the panel. It's very well written. It talks about how to do the meal. We've revised it based on our experience. We talk about everything, including childcare and photography, because there are lessons that we've learned along the way on all of those subjects. And so we're able to put that material, we have that material in the planning guide. We have, every participant gets a packet of materials that's tailored to their community, their county, gives them census data, like I said, the farm census. We have the community food systems languages there. The worksheets are in that. We also put in the food sovereignty information from Via Campesino, and we're starting to add the Native American food sovereignty information, especially in communities that are either Native American or bordering Native American communities. So we're introducing those concepts to people. We also have a facilitators packet that we use during our facilitators trainings, and we have web resources, a sheet of web resources. And what I've done when I do this facilitator training in other places is help them adapt a similar web resource tool that's for their state or community. So I want to talk just a little about budget, because people ask that question: what does it cost to do this? Well, of course, if you're going to act as a facilitator, it's going to be your staffing costs. Then there's some event planning. Some places can do this for absolutely nothing. They use a Grange or a church hall that they get donated. They'll get donated food. We've used all kinds of different models for the meal. Sometimes they do a stone soup model. We really encourage that it be local food. And sometimes it gets donated. We've had everything from beef roast, beef Wellington, to bison roast, to halibut chowder on the coast. But it reflects the community. And people take great pride in those meals and contributing to those meals. The venue is casual, so church basements, Grange halls work great. Community halls, just about anywhere. I think most of the facilities we're in are at least 50 years old sometimes. Like I said, the food, keep it simple. We talk to people about having soup, salad, and bread, and some fruits or vegetables that might be appropriate at the time. It can be really interesting in the winter. You're going to need, we bring the packets, so if you're going to be the facilitator, you're going to be budgeting cost for packets. And then think about what are your follow-up costs going to be. How much are you as an organization going to be involved in follow-up? And what's that going to cost? We have a lot of travel costs that are involved because it's a big state. It can be 500, 600 miles to one of our destinations. So that follow-up work. And the other thing is that if you're working in rural communities, the personal touch is important. So we always make sure that we see people in person at least once, hopefully twice, prior to an event. And then you need to, and then always afterwards. So you're going to have to budget the travel and the necessary lodging and meals and things that go along with that. Evaluation. What kind of evaluation do you want to do? What's that going to cost you? The networking evaluation that Spencer showed you is very time consuming because it has to be done. You do it by email, but to do it very effectively, you have to call everybody, so it takes time. So are you going to get students involved? What are you going to do? We don't do the network. We did the networking evaluation for the first year or two just so that we could document what we knew anecdotally and intuitively. But you're not going to do that kind of evaluation, but what are you going to do and how are you going to carry that forward? And you have to budget for that. So bringing F.E.A.S.T to your community. The F.E.A.S.T model, when people are going to use the F.E.A.S.T model, even if they want to use the community conversation, we ask them to sign an MOU and to report back to us. We're just it's pretty simple. We're asking you to credit Oregon Food Bank with development of the F.E.A.S.T model and related materials. We want to make sure we maintain the integrity of the model, so we don't want you to take it and call it F.E.A.S.T and change it dramatically from what it is. Because we found that this model works, we want to maintain the integrity of it. We want feedback that helps us make improvements and track implementation. And we want to be able to tell our board what's being accomplished, not just in our state, but across the country. So we're asking people to report back to us. I also do F.E.A.S.T facilitator training. The next one is scheduled in Sacramento, and I haven't talked to them. Eric, I think, is on the line. If there are people who want to come to that, we could talk with Eric about that. That one is in April. I haven't scheduled anything for fall yet with anybody, but I am available. I can't fit more than 2 to 3 of these into a year, but we have done, and I did one a year ago in Michigan. So that's a possibility. If that's something you're interested in, we can talk about what those costs are related to that. We do charge something for my time, but we're happy to share this model. And if there are folks, maybe there's a central location where food banks or organizations want to get together in a region and have facilitator training, and we could talk about doing that. So I think we've got time now for questions. We caught up with ourselves.
Yeah, I just sent out a request in the chat box, but if you have any questions, please go ahead and type them in, and I will be directing them to Sharon and Spencer. One question we did have come in is, where does the ripple mapping model come from? Sharon, you had mentioned. Can you just repeat that for everyone?
So the ripple mapping model came out of Community Capital's work, which actually started with Neil and Cornelia Flora, or Neil Flora at Iowa State University. And it's some of the Northwest Area Foundation work. And it's been done, I know, in Minnesota and in Washington State. Beyond that, I'm not sure who else has used it. We actually learned about it through Extension in Washington State.
Great. We do have a question in here about engaging low-income folks. It says, do you have any best practices for engaging low-income people in food system discussions? Sharon or Spencer, would either of you like to take that?
So we're lucky here in Oregon that we have a lot of gleaning organizations that involve low-income people. So that's been one of our go-to places. But going into food pantries and making contacts is one way. It just has to be friendly, and people have to feel comfortable. And because F.E.A.S.T is a very informal process that literally can involve everyone in the room in a simple way, I think it's friendly to that. Also, churches are a good place, and identifying churches in low-income neighborhoods is a good place to reach out. And if you get a pastor from one of those churches that encourages his membership to take part, that's another way that's really helpful.
All right, here's another one. How do you find the key players to invite to the F.E.A.S.T events? Researching online, visiting the communities, cold calls, etc.
So we don't do the invitations. The local leadership team does. And that's the key, is that local leadership team, and doing a brainstorm with them about who should be in the room for their food system, and then making suggestions. And the planning manual actually has a list of suggestions in it.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, one thing that's been really effective is personal invitations. So folks on that leadership team then making personal invitations to folks that they know or groups that they work with. That's been a great way. Also, we have a template for a poster that we can share. That's also been used. Announcements go into newspapers and over radio stations. So there's a number of different techniques that the leadership team will implement based on their community.
Yeah, and I would say if you think about the whole food system and start from there, like, okay, production, we want to get farmers there. What are the groups that are working with farmers that we can invite to F.E.A.S.T? Who are some people that are well connected within that community that can invite their friends and neighbors, and just going through the whole food system and making sure that you have reached out to all of the different sectors. And yeah, as Tracy mentioned, in our organizing manual, we have a long list of all the potential types of organizations that you should consider. Every place is different, but we try to have a somewhat comprehensive list of all of the potential organizations that should be there.
And something that we're focusing on more and more here at Oregon Food Bank is bringing an equity lens to our work. So not only thinking about the different organizations, but also making sure you have a fair representation of the people in your community at the event itself. We got a question about what resources are you willing to share post-webinar. I will be sending out an email which will include a link to the video, a Ripple map example that was requested. And again, upon request, we will send you the planning manual, and you can contact either myself or Sharon or Spencer for that resource. I'll go ahead and put our contact information up right now so you have it. One question we have here, this is a very good one and something we're trying to address more and more, is how do you overcome language barriers and have large discussions with a community that speaks multiple languages?
So that's been an interesting part of our work. The first time we worked with a Latino group to do F.E.A.S.T, we were working with the health department, and they had promontories, and we were under the impression that they fully understood what we were doing, and they had translated. And somehow or another, people coming to the Latino women coming to the F.E.A.S.T thought they were coming for a training on fiestas, so how to do a really nice quinceañera. So that was a learning opportunity for us. It was in a college community, so we had about 20 university folks sitting there waiting to see what the Latino community was going to do, which I would have I would never do again. So we've learned a lot. We have done this in groups. Forest Grove was a place where we had over 100 attendees, and probably 25% at least were Latino. And we just had interpreters doing that. We've also used some of the equipment with the headsets for translation. It's still not the strongest part of our program, but we're working on it. But we have used the one-on-one kind of translation, and just you have to go a little slower when you're doing that, but we've made it work, and I've made that work for other kinds of trainings that we've done.
Another thing that we've done in Corvallis, working with the health department there, was to modify the FE.A.S.T model for the Latino community in Corvallis and really have it be only in Spanish. And so they work through some of the same questions and worksheets and processes as the FE.A.S.T, but doing it all in Spanish and with just the Spanish language community. So that was another example that we've used instead of having simultaneous translation or interpretation, but instead doing it all in Spanish.
Sharon, I'll let you address this one. Have you worked with any First Nation people on reservations?
Yes. Actually, one of our first FE.A.S.T was on the Umatilla Indian Reservation. We also recently started work with Grand Ronde, and one of our partner agencies, regional food banks here, we have a community food assessment this year that's going to be focused on the Grand Ronde tribe and in their region. We also have a plan to work with the Klamath tribe and do a FE.A.S.T in Chiloquin. So we've had a lot of experience in doing that. Before I came to Oregon Food Bank, I'd had a Native American business, so I have a lot of contacts within tribal communities. It's been slower than maybe we would like for it to be, but it's about building trust and building relationships, and we've taken the time to do that. We also do have tribal folks who attend the regular FE.A.S.T in communities like in the Douglas County area. We had a lot of people from the Cow Creek tribe that participated in all of our events down there. So we've been doing that. And like I said, we've adapted. There's a lot of information on the Native American Food Sovereignty site that's very helpful. And working with First Nations Institute, there's information there too.
Okay, we have about 5 more minutes if anyone wants to pose any final questions. I don't see any in the queue, so I'll give you a moment to type in any last things. I will make a request to please fill out the survey that we will send in that follow-up email. It'll be really short, but just gives us information on how we can improve these webinars. Any final thoughts from either of you?
Okay. Thank you for attending.
Yeah.
We appreciate it.
All right. Thank you so much. This webinar has been recorded, and we will post it in about a week and a half. Thank you so much.